it's hard to explain what the values are, because I mean, imagine if I were to ask you what are the values of American artists. There's 1,000 artists have 1,001 values, and it's the same thing here. There a lot of them are just young people trying to come to terms with the way they live and just making stuff that seems interesting to them. I don't think many of them are even very self-consciously out trying to make a statement.
Sure.
They're just trying to do stuff that's interesting, that makes sense to them, that's fun, that impresses their friends. One of the reasons why I ended up in the scene when I started my club, a lot of people say that the music scene really began in my club in that 2005-2012 period. And I think it did, and the reason it did was because I brought a very snobby New York attitude to it, and basically we opened the club and we said the kings of the scene are the artists and everybody else is B-list. We don't give a shit who you are. And we really catered to them. And it didn't matter if they were really well known yet or if they were just starting out and we thought they might be good. They were all treated as important, and they used to come there every day and they used to compete with each other and sort of, there was rivalry, there was cooperation. It was just a lot of fun for them to outdo each other. And I think a lot of artists do that. I mean, I don't think there's this really self-conscious attempt to explain anything. Yeah, they're just, they just thought the music was really cool and they wanted to do something slightly cooler than what their friends had done.
Is it, are we able to say that in China, where a lot of things are very under the surface, where there's a lot of self-censorship, or as you said, deliberate hiding of lives, depending on which generation you have to interact with, that music, and in particular music that is very welcoming, very come as you are, very much about trying to just develop art for the sake of doing so, that it allows individuals to find a voice even if they're not coming in with political intentions?
I think so, and I think that's what makes the music so exciting. A lot of friends of mine who are well-known musicians or critics abroad, when they come here, they almost always describe the scene in the same way. They say it's so fresh. There's a real freshness to it. Like, you do avant-garde music, experimental music, rock and roll in the West, and there's so much baggage that you have. You immediately are part of a particular scene, and you even sometimes you have to dress certain ways, etc., listen to certain musics. And here, it's going to get that way. In fact, it's already starting to get that way. And I always knew that would happen. If we were successful, that was going to happen. But what was interesting here is you have to remember that until the early part of the last decade, people who were really interested in music, they would whisper about, Lou Reed and about Charlie Parker and about Messiaen and Steve Reich, but they never really heard the music. Because the only music they heard was the CDs that were brought in by, say, diplomats or something. And diplomats don't have especially good taste. So there's all this talk. I mean, they're just ordinary stuff. You're more likely to get the Police than you are to get Velvet Underground. So they'd heard of all of these things, and they're very curious. But it's very rare to hear the music. Maybe you heard one thing, something of the... But then with the internet in 2002, 2003, suddenly everybody got online. And suddenly the entire world, the last 100 years of music, was just dumped on them. And I think that must be the most exciting way to experience this music without any historical baggage at all. It's just stuff to listen to. And it's like, kids in a toy store. They would, grab a doll, then grab a toy truck, and then grab a coloring book. There really wasn't any method to it. And that, I think, had an enormous impact on the scene. It was just this treasure chest of stuff that was happening. And so for a lot of the musicians, it was just really exciting. They could follow anything they wanted. It was all equally valid, equally cool. There wasn't any hierarchy like this music is cool, that music is not cool. If you're a minimalist, you can't like Stockhausen or whatever. They didn't know any of that, and so that really shows up in the music as part of that freshness, part of that playfulness. Yeah. And as we were doing the series, what we found is that the musicians sort of grouped themselves naturally in these various groups where they were all sort of playing together. When I closed the D22, because it started to get too famous and we were getting a crowd that I didn't really like, we decided to reopen another club without any advertising, focusing on just one strand that came out of D22, and that was the so-called Zoomin night. Every Tuesday, Ju Wenbo would bring a bunch of these the high school kids from Beijing and Tianjin. They would all come in from Tianjin on the train to be there Tuesday night. And it was very strange because they weren't self-consciously avant-garde. They are now the heart of the avant-garde scene in China. But at the time, they were high school kids that were just playing with stuff. They were, some of them were quite good at had no idea how to play any instrument. They were just a bunch of kids who got together and were just doing stuff every Tuesday night. I gave them the club, and it developed into an amazing scene. But there was no programmatic quality to it. It just sort of happened. And when I then ended up closing XP, Ju Wenbo moved the concert series to an underground pass, a subway pass, because the acoustics were really good. And it was that sort of quality. It was like, well, you know, not many people are going to come anyway, and this place has really great acoustics and we don't have to pay rent. So every Tuesday they would just go there and do a show. And it's that sort of scene that developed.
On one hand, it seems that the lack of both political baggage and the lack of sort of maybe what an artist should be, what a Chinese person should be, has given Chinese artists an incredible amount of freedom to create as they see fit. On the other hand, what I'm very curious about is the role of people like Cui Jian, who are viewed as heroes within the music scene by many people, and the government's role in sort of seeing figures like Cui Jian and the tension that comes from both wanting to create soft power, create art, but being aware that it may be a force that they need to monitor and control at times, and what that looks like.
Sure. Cui Jian he came up in a very different time. That was a time at the end of the Cultural Revolution when there was this sense of unlimited political possibilities for China. There really was a sense that China was rapidly moving towards a completely different political system. And that all ended in the 90s. And the generation that came after that, so after Cui Jian, who I think of as really the late 1980s, you then had this big heavy metal movement in the early 90s, and then this punk movement. Neither of them to me were very interesting because they were really formalized. They were ways of expressing you know, your refusal to be part of the mainstream, but in a very formal way. You knew what to do, what to dress, what to talk about, what to like, what to dislike. It was really in the late 90s and early part of the last decade that you started getting all of these weirdos doing very interesting, different music. A lot of it very really cool stuff. In fact, one of my projects, and I'm still looking for somebody who will do it for me, is to go and collect all that stuff before it gets lost and then sort of anthologize it. There's some really weird stuff coming out. And it sort of coalesced in the early part of the last decade. The influence of Yang Haisong is really major there, because Yang Haisong's band, PK14, was, in my opinion, the first band that taught Chinese that rock and roll could really be a Chinese medium. Before that, the more foreign you were, the better you were. And then suddenly you could be Chinese and exploit rock and roll as a medium, as an art. And that's when you started to see this whole new development. And Sui Jian was treated very unfairly because he was really looked down on and disliked by a lot of young artists. It's interesting because his reputation is now starting to grow. I think many of these young musicians, as they're getting older, are starting to reevaluate Sui Jian and see him as a legitimate ancestor. And in my opinion, quite frankly, his most recent music is much more interesting. I find that what he was doing back then may have been politically important and sentimental, etc. Sure. But musically, I think it was, it's fairly simple. If he wasn't who he was at his time, none of us would know who he is. Sure. The stuff that he's been doing in the last 10 years, to me, is actually quite interesting stuff. And I don't know if that's part of it or not, but you hear people are much more admiring of him now than they used to be 10 years ago. And I think that's probably normal. I mean, it's, young artists always kill their parents and right? And he was sort of the father of the scene, and so everybody turned against him. And then after a while, they started to re-embrace him. And already you're starting to see, something like a band like Cars, which just completely changed the scene. There was a period when it sort of became cool to say you didn't like them, and now it's no longer cool to say that. So you see all of these changes take place, which is all sort of bullshit. It's part of the politics of any art scene. But you have to see them. You have to see them within that line. There is this line. But for a lot of us, music really started to become interesting, not as a social phenomena, but as an art. In the beginning of the last decade. That's when you started to see people like Xiao He, Yang Haisong, and that group. Yang Jun was doing really interesting stuff. And that's when I think Beijing started to become an important city for music.
And to circle back a bit, so how, in what sounds like a very rich life, did you end up in Beijing? And then how did maybe Mars come into being?
I grew up in a lot of different countries, and I went to college in New York, and I worked in New York. And New York is still, I consider it my home, and I'll go back there. But around at the late 90s, early part of the last decade, I got a little bit bored, and I thought I want to do something I haven't done before. And I thought, there's two huge countries that I know nothing about, India and China. And I chose to come to China. I don't know why. Very, very lucky. And the plan was to be here for 2 or 3 years and return to New York. But I've been here 16 years, and I'm going to be here several more years. But I've always been involved in music. I had a label in New York, and I had a club in the East Village in the early days. And so when I came here, I immediately started going to all of the shows. And it used to really kill me because there was such an inferiority complex. Anything foreign was better than anything Chinese. I remember seeing some Belgian band that absolutely sucked, and they played, they were terrible, and they played with PK-14, which, it's not just me. Famous musicians around the world are saying they are one of the most interesting bands in the world, and the Belgian band got all of the respect from the Chinese audiences as well as the foreign audiences, and PK-14 was like, well, they're the Chinese opening band. They killed them. And I remember after seeing that show, I was just so pissed off. I said, okay, that's it. I'm opening my club, and in my club, it's the good Chinese musicians who are, we spent the first 2 years just trying to convince the Chinese that they were doing stuff as interesting as anything happening in New York. And it took a while because they wouldn't believe me. And then we finally managed to convince them, and you can see the change. I mean, there's this enormous surge of confidence that they really are as good as their heroes in New York and in Berlin. And we've gotten, people like Rick Mamie from Brian Jonestown Massacre, who practically lives in Beijing now. I mean, he said something really interesting. He said that the Beijing scene was the first time in his life that he didn't feel he had been born too late to catch it. So he was born too late to catch the Haight-Ashbury and to catch the London of the Beatles and to catch the punk thing. And he missed all of those things. And he said this time he was born in time and he caught it. And I think he's right. I think we were able to catch something really big.
And then for the origins of maybe Mars, is that something you could describe?
Yeah, what happened there was after a few years, there were just so many great bands that were coming out. I mean, I knew within 2 years that, so I thought it would take 10 or 20 years to do it. Within 2 years, I knew that we had an amazing scene going. There was just stuff happening everywhere, but there was really only one label. And when there's only one label, they have a tendency to become a little arrogant. And Carsey Cars at the time was just blowing everybody away. And they produced the record. It was the first record Yang Haisong produced, and he's now produced half of the great records in China. He's just an amazing producer. I gave them the money to produce it, and when they had finished it, it paid for everything. They went to the label, and the label was definitely going to sign them. I mean, there was no question. But they asked me to come along to the meeting, and frankly, it was so arrogant that I was fuming again when we walked out. And I told Yang Haisong, I said, look, how about if we just start our own label? And he said, I wanted to do this for years. I said, fine, we're going to start our own label. And we thought it would just be, 3 or 4 bands, just give them an alternative way of getting their stuff out. And it just exploded. It grew so quickly. And, we're very proud of the fact that every interesting band wants to join the label. In fact, I don't know how many times when we've signed a band, they'll say, the day we started our band, we had 3 goals. One of them was to get signed by Maybe Mars. And we're very proud of that. We lose a lot of money, which is probably why we're a good label, because we really support our artists. We make sure they tour abroad, which is very important for them. And we spend money on producing their records. We brought well-known producers from abroad who've given us cut-rate deals in order to help, develop a production capacity here in China. We're now at the point where you can produce really good records in China. In fact, I think Yang Haisong, if he were American or English, you wouldn't be able to, if you wanted him to produce your record, you'd have to get in line. But because of them at home. But 10 years ago, the production quality was shit. It was really tough. We had to build all of that, and I'm glad to say that Maybe Mars, I think, took a real lead in all of that.
Something that you have mentioned, you've done a very good job just over the scope of this conversation outlining points of the history in a way I think people
I lived it so intensely for 16 years. Yeah.
Something I think that's really interesting, a theme that's come up multiple times, even though we haven't addressed it explicitly, is this idea of an inferiority complex for the Chinese.
Yeah.
We have sort of, I think, 2 forces, one in China and one in the West. With China, we have the rise of like sort of 爱国者 and more individuals who are, and maybe we see this globally, full-throated nationalism, the idea of
Right.
really strongly supporting your own country to the point that it becomes a bit scary.
Well, that kind of nationalism always comes from an inferiority complex.
Yeah.
When you really feel confident about your nationality, about your country, you tend not to be, you can be patriotic, but you tend not to be nationalistic. And you see it in the States too. It's the people who are most sort of, who most lack confidence vis-a-vis, say, Europe, who are the most, anti-European and, fuck the foreigner sort of thing. And that happens in China too. There's a very strong strain of nationalism. But I'm glad to say that among the artists and all that, obviously there isn't.
That was more of a bridge to this point where that story of the Belgian band is very interesting. I talked to Marshall of Temple Bar last night, and he was talking about this idea of the Columbus complex, which I think a friend, perhaps even Will, had
What's
coined.
the Columbus complex?
It's the idea of foreigners coming to China and imagining that they will be the first of let's say, comedian, or not realizing there's Dashan, or the first MC, not realizing there's Bohan Phoenix, or the first, Chinese American male-female group, not realizing there's both subs and the nocturnes, and so on and so forth.
Well, Hang on the Box, one of the greatest female groups, I think, in any country.
I'm wondering if there's a way, without being too harsh, we can address the idea of foreigners who are coming to China as either tourists or to live or to do business, in maybe looking in a critical way at maybe our own inferiority complex of constantly trying to either otherize Chinese culture or make our own culture superior, or say, oh, that's just derivative of the New York Dolls or the Talking Heads or Radiohead. Is there an attitude or sort of sense of a frame of mind you've been able to obtain for yourself that's allowed you to gently sort of help people be more comfortable learning from Chinese culture as opposed to trying to teach?
But I think I know 3 foreigners here. And there are people like Marshall and Nevin who don't really have that problem. I've been, I guess, an expat for much of my life, although it's hard to know what that means because my dad's American, but my mom's French. I was born in Spain. I've got a Persian sister-in-law, Muslim niece. We're pretty mixed, but we've lived in lots of different countries. And one of the things I learned from my father is in the expat community, there's a small group of people that are really incredibly interesting people, but the majority of expats are, they're punching above their weight. As a foreigner, you're always taken more serious. It's true in any country. In the U.S., if you're European, people take you a bit more seriously, and if you're American in England, and that happens here too. So, the expat community is, to me, not terribly interesting. One of the things that happened in the club is, before I opened my club, the expats dominated the music scene, and the best Chinese bands were the bands that made friends with the expats, and they did all the drinking in the bars, so the bars really catered to them, etc. Which, reasonable, you got to pay rent. And in our place, we didn't do that. In our place, there was a hierarchy. I'm from New York. We're very hierarchical, but the top of the hierarchy was the best musicians, and by the time you reach the expats, it was several layers down. It was the musicians that dominated everything. We gave them the run of the club. You could come in free. In fact, let me interrupt you and tell you a story. The musicians were so important that the boyfriend or the girlfriend is in a band. So Joyside, one of our main bands, Bien Yuen came to me and said at one point, my girlfriend, Young Fan, is in a band. And I said, oh, that's fine. Yes, I'll book her Friday. Girlfriend's band, whatever, we'll book them because Joyside gets whatever they want. They own the club if they like. And so we booked the girlfriend's band, and the girlfriend's band turned out to be herself besides me. Maybe the greatest band in China. It was a band that when they performed, Nevin and I were just sitting there gasping. We just couldn't believe how good they were. Young Fan is a genius, a very difficult genius, and she produces very little work because she hates everything she does. But I just thought it was a funny story because the musicians dominated. They could go behind the bar, they could serve themselves drinks. We gave them everything. and including we allowed their girlfriends and boyfriends to perform. And I think a lot of expats really, at first, were really pissed off at us. I mean, we got slammed by the expat community simply because we said we follow the same rules that we do in any other city, and that is this is a music club, so the musicians are at top, not the foreigners. And ever since then, I mean, foreigners comprise about 2% of the population of Beijing, so they probably comprise about 2% of the interesting people, which is not a lot. So most of the interesting people that I know are from Beijing. So I can't really tell you too much about them. And I don't pay an awful lot of attention to whether or not they get it, because the most important audience for our musicians tends to be other musicians, the musicians they respect. Secondly, tends to be local young Chinese, that is their natural audience. And what we're really interested in is building that Chinese audience. Whether the foreigners, the expats, like them or not, I don't think really, it's just not something we spend a lot of time worrying about. And they do.